Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Great. Today, we're heading back to the Roaring '20s.
The jazz age.
Well, we're going a little deeper, a little darker. Think Al Capone's Chicago.
Now that's a story.
And our guide for this journey is Jonathan Eig's Get Capone.
Great book.
It really goes beyond the Scarface headlines.
A much more complex picture, yeah.
We're talking the man, the times, the impact. Capone's Chicago didn't just appear overnight, though, right?
You're absolutely right. To really understand it, we need to rewind a bit, see what the city was like before he took over.
So, paint a picture for us. What was the Windy City like before the Tommy guns in the headlines?
Well, in the early 1900s, you had the Levee District, full of saloons, theaters, dance halls, a real mix of everything. Pretty diverse hub, actually.
Sounds lively.
But Eig points out a shift starting to happen.
Oh.
Yeah, as Capone was coming onto the scene, the levee was becoming more notorious, more known for its ripened prostitutes and petty criminals, as Eig puts it.
So the seeds of Chicago's darker side were already being sown.
Exactly. And then comes Prohibition in 1917. The 18th Amendment comes in, outlaws alcohol nationwide.
I can't imagine that went over well.
You'd think, right?
People just suddenly stopped drinking.
Some did. In fact, there were a lot who thought it'd solve all society's problems.
Really?
Prominent folks, too, like Billy Sunday, the evangelist. He predicted this utopia, prisons turning into factories, everyone happy without booze.
Wow. I mean, the idea is nice, but unrealistic.
Hugely unrealistic. And what it did was fuel the very thing they were trying to stop.
Organized crime.
Massive demand for illegal alcohol.
Makes sense. A business opportunity for someone.
Savvy entrepreneurs, let's say.
And that's where we get these gangsters, right? Big Jim Colosimo, for instance.
Colosimo's a perfect example. He ran a popular restaurant. But he was also navigating the underworld, let's just say. Eig paints him as wanting to be high class, profit from the illegal stuff, but keep his hands clean.
Delegate the dirty work. Was that common back then?
It was becoming a trend, but this was also a time when you had guys like Frankie Yale, who Eig describes him as a good-humored fellow.
Good humor.
Yeah, but also a sought-after hitman.
So, running a saloon on Coney Island.
The Harvard Inn. Imagine, grab a drink, hire a killer.
Crazy times. And this is where Capone meets Yale.
Capone was working there as a dishwasher.
The notorious Al Capone, a dishwasher. It's wild how these things start. Most people don't picture that when they think of them.
Right, but from dishwasher, he rises up, joins forces with some of Chicago's most notorious guys. Eig even calls it a triumvirate of power that formed.
Who's in that?
Capone, of course, Torrio, and likely a Chicago native, a guy named Morton. But they were connected to a whole network. Dean O'Banion, the florist-turned-killer.
O'Banion. I've heard that name.
Then there's Jaime Weiss, famous for taking people for a ride.
And Bugs Moran. Wasn't he always dodging bullets?
That's the one.
It's like a real-life gangster movie cast.
Right.
Larger-than-life personalities clashing, shaping the city.
Not just Chicago, they became national figures. Their names synonymous with lawlessness.
And yet, amidst all this, Capone has a family life. Eig says he lived with his wife, May, and their son, Sonny, in a regular two-flat Chicago home.
It's that contrast that's so fascinating. Here's this brutal gangster, but he's got a family, a wife, a kid, a seemingly typical life.
It's hard to reconcile those two images.
Right. There are even those alternative accounts about Sonny's parentage, potentially involving his mother's death during childbirth, and Capone's mother, Teresa, orchestrating the marriage to protect the child.
Wow, a tragic backstory.
Regardless of how it happened, though, it's clear Capone loved Sonny, wanted to protect him, but normal life in that world, constantly under threat.
Right. Eig talks about that chilling attempt on Capone's life right outside his home.
Imagine it's a snowy Chicago morning. Capone's in his Packard, driving down the street. Suddenly, this touring car appears.
Ominous. Touring car. In those days, you knew it wasn't good.
Exactly. This wasn't a world of clean fights. This was shadows, whispers, violence erupting at any moment.
It's easy to romanticize that gangster era, but the reality was it was dangerous.
Very dangerous. And that constant threat shapes Capone's actions, his mindset.
Speaking of danger, wasn't there a murder that made him flee to Michigan?
Yes, but then he does something totally unexpected.
What's that?
He calls up reporters in Chicago and announces his return.
Why would he do that? Draw more attention to himself.
It seems counterintuitive, but Eig points out the 1920s were obsessed with fame.
Ball players, daredevils, those flagpole setters, everyone was looking for their 15 minutes.
Exactly. And Capone, maybe unintentionally taps into that. He's turning himself into a celebrity even though he's a gangster.
Playing the media game, like a modern-day influencer almost.
Right. And it worked. Eig even compares him to Rudolph Valentino.
The silent film heartthrob.
The one and only.
Yeah.
Valentino was in Chicago once, same time as Capone.
Huh.
Capone drew bigger crowds.
Wow. So on the one hand, you have this criminal, a symbol of violence, corruption.
But on the other, he's this charismatic figure. He cultivated that Robin Hood image, too.
Providing for the poor during the Depression, soup kitchens.
Exactly, a walking contradiction. That's what made her so fascinating.
And then there's that scene after he beat the murder charge, leaving the courthouse, narrowly escaping.
Almost getting caught in confrontation with Sergeant McSwiggan,
Whose son, the prosecutor, had been killed.
Under mysterious circumstances, yes. It was a scene straight out of a movie. It perfectly captured that volatility, that danger. Even in victory, Capone's surrounded by enemies looking over his shoulder.
And that summer, 26, with Torrio retiring, Capone's firmly in control.
And the city descends into chaos.
Eig's description of the Foley murder, for example, chilling, just brutal.
Right. And it makes you think, what was the point of all this violence? To instill fear or just business as usual in that world?
It had to be both, didn't it? A way to control, intimidate rivals.
Absolutely. But I also think it became part of the culture. Life in Chicago then, you could get gunned down in broad daylight.
Just walking down the street.
It happened. Think about that machine gun attack on Michigan Avenue.
One of the busiest streets in the city.
Shows how untouchable these gangsters felt. And in many ways, they were. Even the police seemed powerless.
Remember that story about schemer Drucci?
Oh yeah, tackled by a cop during a shootout. Gives a fake name, like it's no big deal.
It's almost funny, in a dark way. Shows how desensitized everyone had become.
And even the media, they're reporting on this stuff, but they seem helpless.
Eig quotes a Chicago Tribune editorial. They say the city has the laws, the force to clean up. But no one seems willing to do it.
Well, corruption was a huge factor. It was everywhere. From the mayor's office down to the beat cops. How do you prosecute gangsters when everyone's on their payroll?
A losing battle.
In many ways, yes, it felt like that, like an unstoppable force. And finally, the feds decide to step in.
Really?
Indictments come down, Capone and his associates, violation of prohibition laws.
So, the government finally taking action.
They're trying, but taking down Capone, that wasn't going to be easy.
Especially when you consider how these guys ran their operations.
Right. Eig talks about Jaime Weiss, for instance. His bootlegging operation ran like a legitimate company, taking orders over the phone, making deliveries, suppliers, distributors, the whole network. One guy even compared him to a bank clerk.
A bank clerk. Talk about a contrast.
Meticulous, organized, focus on the bottom line. It's ironic. These ruthless criminals, they were pioneers of modern business in a way.
And Eig also mentions Weiss's wife, Josephine. She probably suspected what he was up to, but would have married him anyway.
It adds this human element, doesn't it? Even in this brutal world, you have these personal connections. These guys weren't just cogs in a machine. They were husbands, fathers, sons.
And their personal lives, intertwined with the criminal side. Eig describes Little Sicily,
A tough neighborhood.
where a lot of these gangsters operated.
Gritty. Dangerous.
But even there, moments of normalcy.
The Capone family getting their salami delivered from a nearby Chicago factory.
It's almost absurd, bringing a taste of home to the underworld.
Because even in the most extraordinary circumstances, people crave the familiar. Routines makes life a little less chaotic.
But Capone's life, anything but peaceful.
Right. He makes this public declaration, wants peace, a quieter life with his family, but the violence continues.
So, was he truly conflicted, or was that just for show, for his public image?
It's a question historians debate. Was he sincere, tired of the bloodshed, the threats to his family, or just trying to deflect attention? It's hard to know.
I guess that's the enduring mystery of Al Capone, the man behind the myth. Hard to categorize.
Exactly. And as his reign continued, that complexity, it just deepened, leading to a series of events that would change Chicago forever.
So much for peace in Chicago.
Yeah, about that. Didn't last long. Eig focuses on a reporter, Steege, from the Herald and Examiner.
What did Steege do?
This guy really dug deep into the gang wars, even posed for a picture with a Tommy gun.
Wow, talk about immersive journalism.
Right, and he wrote these articles directly challenging Chicagoans, telling them not to just accept the violence.
Bold move.
He called the gangsters out, called them rich, selfish, and ignorant criminals.
And their power.
Said they had so much, they were basically untouchable.
So even with this supposed peace, Chicago was still under their thumb.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just the gangsters themselves. It was this whole system, this web of corruption.
Right. Law enforcement.
Even the press.
Eig talks about this reporter, Alfred Jake Lingle, had a very close relationship with Police Commissioner William F. Russell.
Lingle was walking a dangerous line.
How so?
Getting info from gangsters, passing it on to Russell, and Russell using Lingle to send messages back to the underworld.
Dangerous game.
Turned deadly, actually. Lingle got gunned down.
In broad daylight.
Just like that. Showed how risky it was to get caught in those power struggles.
And even Capone denied involvement.
Claimed he had nothing to do with it. But the damage was done showed just how deep the corruption ran.
And here's a strange thing. The economy was booming in the late 1920s, but crime was actually going up in Chicago.
Seems counterintuitive, right? But Eig explains it. Prohibition plus that widespread corruption. Perfect breeding ground for criminal enterprises.
So the demand for illegal alcohol created huge profits.
And corrupt officials were happy to look the other way. Let these guys run wild.
A perfect storm. Did anyone try to stop it?
Some of Chicago's wealthiest citizens started to get worried.
Like who?
Julius Rosenwald, president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. Eig mentions him. He was alarmed by what he saw.
Because of the violence?
Partly. But they were mostly worried about the impact on business. They understood that all this crime and chaos was bad for Chicago.
Bad for the city's image, bad for profits.
Exactly. Pragmatic guys, these businessmen. They wanted something done.
Put pressure on the authorities to clean things up.
Right. They saw the city's future was at stake. And then, of course, you have the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Infamous. An event that really defines Capone's Chicago, doesn't it?
Eig sets the scene. A cold morning, Moran's men are gathered in a garage. Suddenly, a car pulls up. Guys inside are dressed as cops.
Clever. No reason to be suspicious.
They walk right in, totally caught off guard. And then the shooting starts.
7 men dead. A bloodbath.
Brutal, really solidified Capone's image as this ruthless killer.
But they never definitively proved he did it, right?
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is still a mystery. So many theories. Was it Capone taking out Moran? Was it revenge for something else? Eig goes through all of them.
Leads to more questions than answers, doesn't it?
It does, but one thing's for sure, it was a turning point. Public opinion started to shift. Capone, the Robin Hood image, that started to fade.
People saw the brutality, the coldness.
Exactly. And the feds, they were getting frustrated, couldn't convict him on the usual charges, so they decided to go after something else.
Something unexpected.
Taxes.
Taxes. Seems almost silly, considering everything else he'd done.
But it was a smart move. Eig explains how income tax had been around since the Civil War. Didn't matter where the money came from. You earned it, you gotta pay.
And Capone.
Never filed a tax return. Figured he was above the law.
A mistake.
A big one. They were so busy dodging the cops, they forgot about Uncle Sam.
And that's where Frank Wilson comes in, right?
The accountant. Meticulous. Quiet. Persistent. Spent months going over records, tracing money.
Trying to connect the dots between Capone and his illegal earnings.
Imagine that, the gangster versus the accountant.
Quite a contrast.
Right. Capone, all violence and flash. Wilson, just numbers and paperwork.
David and Goliath.
And Wilson's work paid off. He found the evidence. The net was closing in.
But then there's that strange incident in Miami.
Oh, the concealed weapon charge.
Yeah. Oh, it's just hard to believe. Al Capone getting caught with a gun?
It shows how arrogant he was. Thought he was untouchable. Eig says he was totally relaxed about it, joking with reporters.
Putting on a show.
Exactly. But that arrest, even though it was minor, it played a role.
How so?
It fueled that public perception that he was above the law. Added to the momentum to take him down.
So, even though he escaped serious consequences that time, he was a sign of things to come.
It's often the little things that trip you up, the overlooked details. Even for someone like Al Capone.
Last we left off, Capone was facing tax evasion charges, thanks to Frank Wilson's investigation.
And that's what ultimately brought him down. Not the violence, not the bootlegging, but taxes.
It's almost poetic justice, isn't it?
You could say that. Eig really emphasizes that shift in law enforcement's strategy.
They couldn't get it on those other charges.
So they went after the money.
And the trial itself, that was a huge media event.
Oh yeah, everyone was watching. And the judge, James Herbert Wilkerson, he wasn't known for being lenient.
Tough judge, huh?
Very tough. Believed in the law no matter who you were. So the courtroom, it was packed, reporters everywhere. The public, they were captivated, this invincible gangster facing the legal system.
Must have been intense. What were some of the highlights? Eig goes into a lot of detail about the trial, right?
He does. It's like you're right there in the courtroom. You see the prosecution, very methodical, presenting their evidence, connecting Capone to all those illegal profits. And the defense, they're trying to paint him as a victim.
A businessman just caught up in the system.
Exactly. But the jury didn't buy it.
What was the verdict?
Guilty on all counts.
Wow, that's got to be a blow. His empire, built on all that violence and crime, brought down by taxes.
It really shows you no one's above the law. Sometimes the simplest weapon, like a tax form, can be the most effective.
So what happens to Capone after the conviction? Does he go quietly?
Well, it's interesting. This is where we start to see a different side of Capone, a more vulnerable side.
Vulnerable. The guy known as Scarface.
Right. But in prison, he's diagnosed with syphilis.
A serious illness, especially back then.
And not just any syphilis, neurosyphilis. It affects the brain.
Oh, wow, that's even worse.
Eig thinks he probably had it for years, just dormant. But now, in prison, it starts to take hold. Affects his mind, his body.
So behind that tough exterior, he's battling this debilitating disease.
Exactly. And those stories about him running the prison, living it up, not true at all. He was struggling. Physically, mentally.
And Eig includes some of Capone's letters, right? The ones he wrote to his family.
It does, and they're heartbreaking. You see this love, this longing for his wife and son, regret for his past, fear for the future. He even wrote a poem for May, for Mother's Day.
It's hard to imagine that. Scarface writing poetry.
It's a side most people never saw, the doting husband, the loving father. It reminds you that even people who do terrible things, they're still capable of love. They're not just monsters.
They're human. Flawed, complex.
Exactly. And as the illness progresses, his letters, they get more and more desperate. He wants to be with his family, to get out of prison, escape what's happening to him.
His lawyers, they tried to get him released, right?
Oh, they fought hard. Appeals, arguments that he was too sick to be incarcerated, but the government, they wouldn't budge. He was going to serve his time.
And eventually he's sent to Alcatraz.
The infamous island prison, considered inescapable. Designed to break you.
And for Capone?
It was a living hell. Isolated, sick, his mind and body deteriorating, dementia, seizures, hallucinations. A tragic end for a man who was once so powerful.
What a contrast. From the king of Chicago to a prisoner in Alcatraz.
It shows how quickly things can change, how fragile we all are, really.
But even in his weakened state, people were still fascinated by him.
Right. Oh, yeah. Those rumors about his hidden fortune, millions stashed away, the legend of Scarface lived on.
It's like a cautionary tale, the rise and fall of a criminal empire. And we're still captivated by it all these years later. Books, movies, TV shows, Capone is everywhere.
He's become an icon, a symbol of both the allure and the danger of organized crime.
So what's the takeaway? What can we learn from Capone's story? Is it just a glimpse into a bygone era, or is there something more there?
I think it shows us that history is never simple. These notorious figures, they're complex. Capone's rise and fall, it's a reflection of the American dream, the potential for success, and how easily it can be corrupted.
And our fascination with true crime, it hasn't faded. Why are we still so drawn to stories like this?
It's that intrigue, the danger. These stories tap into something primal. But maybe now we understand the complexity more. We're not just looking for good guys and bad guys. We're trying to understand the forces that shape people, the choices they make.
In Chicago itself, what lessons can be learned from their experience with organized crime, especially now, with all the challenges we face today?
Chicago's story and Capone's role in it, it shows how important it is to address the root causes of crime. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, and how corruption, it can really cripple a system. We need leaders who are willing to fight for what's right, leaders we can trust.
Well, it's been quite a deep dive exploring Al Capone's Chicago. From those early days in the Levee District to Alcatraz, we've seen how one man's ambition, his ruthlessness, changed a city, and how his story still resonates today.
A story filled with drama, violence, corruption, but also those glimpses of humanity, those unexpected twists of fate.
If anyone wants to learn more, I highly recommend Eig's book, Get Capone. It's a fantastic read.
Really digs deep into a complex era.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.